Let's talk about perhaps the most horrifying of the traitor legions, at least in the current day of the setting. They were a bit more normal before that. The Death Guard. Among my favourite of the original 20, though led by probably my least favourite Primarch, the Death Guard are bloated, disease-ridden husks, intent on blessing the galaxy at large with their gifts. But they weren't always like that. I mean, obviously they would have been wiped out immediately, but let's have a little look at what they were doing pre-Tentai, shall we? Before we get into the video proper, I would just like to say a huge thank you to my channel members, Vort, Cersei and Victory Kaiser, for supporting me. Anyways, on with the video. Originally created during the Unification Wars on Terra, the first recruits of the 14th Legion came from Britain. The tribes of Albia, as it is called in 40k speak, were never actually conquered by the Emperor. In battle after battle, they managed to hold off Big E's Thunder Warriors with their own proto-dreadnoughts and Ironside warriors, though admittedly they did so at a frighteningly high cost to themselves. Admitting the clear martial superiority of the British Isles, Big E instead sought a diplomatic solution. He came to the Albion clan lords unarmed and unarmoured, telling them of his dream for a united humanity, and offering them glory amongst the stars, which they, perhaps surprisingly considering their history with tyrants, accepted, and provided some of the early recruits for the Death Guard, Iron Hands, and Night Lords. This cultural background, on top of influencing the Legion's iconography, also influenced the tactics that they developed. They functioned mostly as heavy infantry, specialising in survivability and stubborn defence, and preferred to conduct major ground attacks at twilight, leading to them being christened the Dusk Raiders by the Emperor himself. Their armour was originally unpainted, except for battle decorations and Albion imagery. I don't know exactly what that entails, maybe the England flag? Except for their right arm and shoulder pad. These were coloured red, to show that they were the Emperor's red right hand. Oh, I love that song. As one of the legions that fought the longest without their Primarch, the Dusk Raiders developed both a strong sense of identity and stubborn pride within themselves, and a terrifying reputation amongst their enemies, with many foes simply throwing down their weapons at nightfall so they would not have to fight them. Despite this, they were still noted as being honourable and merciful when they could get away with it, honouring truces and early surrenders, at least as long as their enemies were unmutated humans, similarly to the Ultramarines. I hope you didn't like the sound of any of that, because their dad stripped them of that identity almost as soon as he showed up. Before we get into his backstory, I want to make it very clear that I am firmly of the opinion that anyone who says Perturabo is the pettiest and most whiny Primarch has simply forgotten about the existence of Mortarion, and it angers me that his model is so cool. Anyway, when the infant Primarchs were scattered from the Emperor's laboratory on Terra, this little bitch was sent to Barbarus. In all fairness to Morty, Barbarus was a feral deathworld wreathed in poisonous fog, and wasn't exactly built to nurture a strong and healthy baby boy. In addition to the whole poisonous fog thing it had going on, Barbarus was also ruled over by the tyrannical overlords, possibly Xenos, possibly some form of demon, and possibly just chaos-corrupted and mutated humans. We don't know as far as I'm aware. Or whatever they were, the overlords were powerful psychers with a particular penchant for necromancy, able to withstand the poisonous air that clouded the mountains of Barbarus, and very much against the few humans who lived among the planet's lowlands having any fun at all. Little baby Morty was found by the most powerful of these overlords, High Overlord Nakar. Nasser? We'll go with Nasser, that's the most fun to say. In the middle of a battlefield that was far too high in the mountains for a normal human to survive. Nasser took in the child to raise as his heir, testing the limits of Mortarion's resistance to the planet's atmosphere, and keeping him in a fortress positioned exactly at that limit, while building his own new keep above that to keep himself safe. Actually a big brain move by Nasser there, I won't lie. As with many of the Primarchs, Mortarion quickly learned the intricacies of warfare from his adoptive father, fighting at the head of Nasser's armies against the reanimated forces of the other overlords. However, throughout all of this, Mortarion remained curious of the humans living at the foot of the mountains, and he would eventually escape from his captivity and flee down the mountain, where he found a young man known as Callus Typhon, who introduced him to his tribe. Upon learning that his entire life up until this point had been a lie, and that these people were actually the same species as him, Morty was consumed by rage directed at Nasser, both for keeping him from them and inflicting centuries of torment upon them. Presumably he was fine with that until he realised they were actually people. Originally, Mortarion was viewed with suspicion and fear by most of the tribe, which was honestly fair enough. I mean, look at the guy. This was before he turned traitor, by the way. This was loyalist Mortarion. Despite that, though, he did what he could to help around the village, and remained a generally useful and productive member of his new society, until the village was attacked by the undead army of a lesser overlord. Mortarion charged the attackers, wielding a huge two-handed scythe and pursuing the overlord high into the poisonous mountains before slaying it, and cementing his place as the saviour of the village. After that, Mortarion taught the villagers all that he had learned from Nasser of warfare and industry, eventually leaving his new home to teach other villagers how to defend themselves from the armies of the overlords. After presumably quite a while of nobody thinking of this, Mortarion came up with the bright idea of creating breathing apparatus to enable the humans to venture into the fog. He recruited the strongest and most resilient from among the villages he visited, forming them into elite units and cladding them in crude armour. These Death Guard, as Mortarion named them, could pursue the forces of the overlords into the toxic fog and survive, allowing them to kill the overlords themselves for the first time in their long existence on the planet. In the ensuing campaigns, Mortarion would continue to improve the breathing equipment and campaign ever further into the fog, with the constant exposure to the toxins of the world hardening his warriors, a useful and transferable skill retained by the Astartes version of the Death Guard later on. The only place that Mortarion and his warriors could not access was the mansion of Nasser, and so Mortarion returned to his village in order to prepare further. When he returned, Mortarion found word of an amazing visitor who brought promises of salvation to Barbarus. This is the first hint of Mortarion's ego problems, as he was not happy with the idea that this stranger was stealing his glory. He kicked down the door to the banquet hall to find the village elders talking with the stranger, who was Big E if you hadn't put that together yet. I did find it quite funny that Emps is described as absolutely yoked and super tanned in comparison to both Mortarion and the population of Barbarus. Anyway, the Emperor challenged Mortarion to take the final mansion alone, asking that if he failed, he swear loyalty to him. I don't know what leverage Emps has here, but I guess Morty isn't the best negotiator. He marched his anorexic ass to the top of the mountain and got his shit absolutely rocked by Nasser, and he would have died if the Emperor hadn't stepped between them to kill the Overlord with a single sweep of his sword and mog the shit out of Morty. While Mortarion did stand by his word and pledge loyalty to the Emperor, who only then actually revealed to him that he was the Emperor and gave him command of his legion, having his vengeance stolen from him planted a seed of resentment and bitterness within Mortarion that would slowly fester and blossom into his eventual betrayal. Now, would this have been that much of a problem if it was someone more well-adjusted, like Guilliman? Almost certainly not. Morty was definitely a petulant child even before the kill-stealing. But, and this is a big but, could the Emperor not have, rescued Mortarion and given him another go? Or offered him power armor? Or, I don't know, pretended to have a little bit of a harder job killing Nasser? It just seems really poorly handled, on the level of making Angron watch his gladiator family die in front of him. Emps really wasn't the most in tune with his son's emotions, was he? At least he gave Mortarion the Sayer's Scythe, that was nice of him. Regardless of the Emperor's poor parenting, Mortarion quickly set about removing everything that made the 14th what they were, and replacing it with various Barbaran ideals. His first words to the Legion were, in Typhon's own words, the first and last time he spoke with anything approaching affection. You are my unbroken blades. You are the Death Guard. Thus was the Legion renamed, and Mortarion's words were engraved above the airlock door of the battle-barred Reaper's Scythe in honour of that moment. The veterans of the Death Guard still refer to themselves as the Unbroken in reference to this. Their armour was also changed from the unpainted grey and red of the Dusk Raiders to the cream and dark green of the Death Guard. Like all the legions, the Death Guard was, at this point, almost entirely formed of Terran-born Marines, though almost all new recruits would be drawn from Barbarus, the Legion's new homeworld. This drastically changed their culture and traditions, and resulted in increasing tensions between the new Barbaran Marines and the older Terrans, who remembered the Dusk Raiders more fondly. The new Death Guard specialised in infantry heavy assaults, organised into units of foot sloggers rather than mechanised squads. Mortarion ensured that his Marines were well equipped and highly trained, able to fight in almost any kind of atmosphere, and placed little emphasis on specialised fast assault units such as jump packs. Unlike the other legions, the Death Guard did not have dedicated assault and tactical squads, instead equipping every Marine with a bolter, bolt pistol and close combat weapon, assuming that the individual would be able to figure out which one was best in a given situation. They were also well known for their use of Terminator Plate, all of which culminated in a legion which was highly successful in both boarding actions and close quarter fighting. Thanks to Morty's hatred of witchcraft, actually quite understandable considering his upbringing, he refused to allow his legion to make use of psychic powers, and kept his own psychic abilities hidden, refusing to develop or use them. He also discouraged his Marines from cleaning their armour, or repairing minor battle damage, as a way of showing off how much damage they had endured while staying standing. With the benefit of hindsight, you do really wonder whether Emps paid literally any attention to his sons before the heresy. Like, could we not have figured out that these guys were at least Nurgle adjacent? The Death Guard were also unique among the legions in that they had only 7 great companies, though they were each bigger than the other legions, and Mortarion's Terminator bodyguard, known as the Death Shroud, numbered only 49. This raises a question that I've always had about the pre-heresy traitor legions. So, Nurgle's number is 7, right? So the Nurgle Legion has 7 companies and 7 times 7 Death Shroud. But at this point, Mortarion has literally no idea that Nurgle even exists, let alone what his favourite number is, so what exactly is going on there? Like, I know out of universe it's just a fun little bit of foreshadowing for the early heresy novels, but what does it mean in universe? If any of you know what that's about, please let me know, because it's always nagged at me and I've never been able to find an answer. The gene seed of Mortarion, combined with the toxins of Barbarus and the ritual poison drinking that the Legion indulged in, made the warriors of the Death Guard exceptionally resilient, even before they were corrupted by Nurgle. This allowed them to deploy into the most hazardous war zones, where even other Space Marines might struggle, and they made widespread use of rad and phosphex weapons alongside viral toxins that gave them something of a dark reputation amongst their peers. This reputation was not helped by Mortarion himself, who remained an outcast among his brothers, only growing close to Conrad Kurz and Horus Lupercal. Presumably, he liked Kurz because they were both freakish losers, but the more interesting relationship is with Horus. The War Master used his legion in coordination with Morty's frequently, with the Death Guard drawing out the enemy and tying them down, allowing the Lunar Wolves to strike at their leaders. This tactic worked brilliantly, and led to a developing closeness between the two Primarchs. Because of his lingering resentment from the death of Nasser, Mortarion believed that Horus appreciated his worth more than the Emperor himself, and was undoubtedly more loyal to Horus than to Emps. Big E would, rather tragically, claim that loyalty to Horus was de facto loyalty to himself, as Horus was his closest son. Unfortunately, Erebus happened. At the outbreak of the Horus heresy, the loyalist sections of the Death Guard were culled on the surface of Istvan III. Roughly a third of the Legion was still loyal to the Emperor at the time, mostly Terran veterans who still clung to their old identity as the Dusk Raiders. Included among these loyalists were a dreadnought named Huron Farl and Captain Ulyss Temeter. I won't go into detail here, mainly because I simply can't bear to do that to myself, but look them up if you want to cry. On a more positive note, a number of Death Guard and one old man, led by Nathaniel Garrow, owner of the biggest balls in the galaxy circa M31, would use the frigate Eisenstein to run the traitor blockade of the Istvan system and bring news of the heresy to Terra, though they were too late to stop the dropsite massacre on Istvan V. The Legion fought alongside Horus in many battles and raids throughout the heresy, splitting into two fleets, one led by Mortarion and the other by Callus Typhon. I mentioned him earlier. He is now a Space Marine and a Nurgle worshipper. If you want more information on him specifically, I made a video about him a while ago, I'll link it somewhere. Mortarion's fleet attempted to convince Jagatai Khan and the White Scars to join the heresy, causing a revolt amongst the Scars' fleet, but ultimately failing to sway the Legion as a whole. By the time the two Death Guard fleets rejoined, Typhon had become annoyed with Mortarion's failure to embrace the ruinous powers, and he hatched a plan to fix that little speed bump. When the fleet embarked for Terra, Typhon killed their navigators, claiming that they remained loyal to the Emperor, and that he and his new librarians could lead the fleet to Terra. Predictably, he instead led them into a trap, stranding them within the warp and allowing the Destroyer Plague to infect the Death Guard. Described as the most horrific and vile plague in Grandfather Nurgle's arsenal, which is saying something, the Destroyer Plague inflicted the Death Guard with unimaginable pain, sickness and corruption, though due to their resilience they could not die. In an effort to save his sons from their suffering, Mortarion gave up his soul to Nurgle, becoming a demon prince, and the Death Guard were remade into a shambling army of diseased plague marines, though they were at least spared from the pain of the Destroyer Plague, if not its other effects. I will say this for Mortarion, he only fell to chaos because he cared for his sons. He was more than willing to endure the pain of the Destroyer Plague himself, but he could not bear to see his sons suffering as they did. As a quick aside, if you aren't sure who Nurgle is, he is the chaos god of disease, decay, despair, destruction, death, and rebirth. It is from him that every disease to plague mortals originates, and he also has an Eldar goddess tied up in his goon cave. Don't worry too much about that last bit. The followers of Nurgle see him as a generous god, referring to him as Grandfather Nurgle, and view their many infections and mutations as gifts. In fairness, those followers are usually immune to the pain and suffering that comes with their mutations, so Nurgle is honestly probably the best god of the four to serve, if you don't mind being a bit smelly, and the maddening amount of pain and suffering before you become immune, actually. There was a little bit more that the Death Guard did, both during and after the Siege of Terra, but it's honestly not all that relevant to this video, so we'll skip ahead a bit. By the 42nd millennium, the Death Guard are immensely mutated plague hulks, clad in rotten and rusting armour. They have lost the ability to care for much of their technology, instead replacing it with living, equally pox-ridden biomass, as is most apparent when looking at their ships. They have, however, retained much of their resilience, and indeed the many gifts of Nurgle have have only increased that power, allowing them to shrug off wounds that would disable or outright kill unmutated Astartes. Some among the Death Guard saw their fall to Nurgle as the ultimate defeat of their resilience, forever damning them to a lifetime of feeling constantly icky, while others view it simply as an obvious next step, reveling in Nurgle's gifts and the fortitude that comes with them. Most of all, though, the Death Guard are honestly just tired. They really exemplify the despair part of Nurgle, kinda just going through the motions when in combat, rather than continuing to fight out of lingering resentment or anger towards the Imperium. Except the Purge, those guys are insane, but that's a story for another video. Unlike many of the traitor legions, the Death Guard have pretty much retained their structure since the defeat of Horus, with the Legion containing 7 plague companies, each of whom have their own preferred fighting style and plague of Nurgle, and are broken down into smaller organisational structures that have remained basically unchanged since the earliest days of the pre-heresy Death Guard. Arbiter Ian's video on the Death Guard has a very good section all about their organisation, and I honestly don't feel like I would do anything more than reword what he says if I were to go through that now, so if you want to know more about their organisation specifically, I would highly recommend that video, but after you finish this, I need the watch time. Anyway, to get back on topic, the Death Guard have had one admittedly rather major schism. Typhus and Mortarion have had a pretty toxic relationship ever since the former damned his dad and all his brothers to Nurgle against their will, and the Legion is somewhat split between loyalty to one or the other. Upon reaching the Eye of Terror following the siege, Mortarion claimed the Demon World for himself, naming it the Plague Planet and shaping it into a dark reflection of Barbarus, though with him and his Legion occupying the spot of the Overlords. Mortarion has since become more and more concerned with matters of the war, and spent more and more time sequestered within his Black Manse, which occupies the 3 highest peaks of the planet. This sentimentality and lack of action sickened Typhus, who viewed Mortarion as weak and below him in Nurgle's favour. The Dark Imperium books, where Mortarion and Typhus work together in an attempt to take Ultramar, do a good job of showing their dynamic. They're a fun read. I feel like I've been recommending them a lot recently, but they really are rather good. On the topic of fun Death Guard books, The Lords of Silence is an absolutely horrifying read. You spend a good chunk of the book in the heads of the Plague Marines, who are kinda just enjoying themselves and bickering with one another, and calling Nurglings little lords, which is very cute. And then when it shifts perspective to someone who isn't basically a walking infirmary, it really drives home the extent of their corruption. It's a very fun book. So that was the smelliest group of Space Marines in the 42nd millennium. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much, it really does mean a lot. Like, subscribe, all the rest, and I'll see you all in the next video.